Sir Crispen Tickell, you were advisor to Margaret Thatcher when she was Prime Minister. You were still involved with a very large number of environmental bodies and also with historical bodies too. You believe that, in a sense, we need to rethink the whole business of agriculture and agricultural policy in Europe.
I think we do. I also think we need to rethink a lot of economics, because I think we place at the moment too much magical faith in markets. And as I've been saying at this conference, I think that markets are marvelous at determining prices, but they're incapable of recognizing costs. And we have to understand that markets have only got limited value in determining how things should be done. The Chinese have a good word for it when they say that markets are marvelous at determining prices, but incapable of recognizing costs. And they go on to talk about the need for, let's see, growth, clean green growth in a different way, not the usual GNP, GDP stuff, which is, I think, not all that interesting.
It does seem that European policymakers have been somewhat obsessed with the idea of trying to make sustainable farming, creating a system under which the environment will thrive. At the same time, the farmers complain that they're getting squeezed between their suppliers and the people they have to sell to, the food processing industry and the retailers.
I think it's a question of how the farmers how the farmers market their goods and how they get paid. Because if governments set the ground rules, governments can set incentives and they can set disincentives. If they produce a disincentive, then farmers have to take account of it, and likewise they can profit from an incentive. So I think that they shouldn't just throw up their hands and say it's all hopeless. It isn't. But a big responsibility rests with how governments and indeed the European Union determines its overall agricultural policy and where it places its priorities.
As you mentioned, that there is an over-reliance on the market as a system for setting prices, if you like, and for various other things too. What is the alternative, though, in a sort of capitalist society in which we live?
Well, we've provoked by President Sarkozy. There was a commission set up under Joseph Stiglitz, an economist of some Nobel Prize quality, who produced a report last September about how to produce a new system of measurement for these things, which I think is very interesting, because his judgments and his view about things changes very much the way in which we place value on one thing and we don't place value on another, and that seems to me of the greatest importance. If you look at the Stiglitz recommendations, you realize how important it is that we measure things differently, and that's one of the things that I would strongly recommend.
When you say measure things differently, what sort of things are we talking about? What sort of measures are involved here?
We're talking about, for example, the apparent advantages of industrial agriculture, big monocultures, which yield a quick return, but within a few years you pay the cost because the soils don't recover, and then you become heavily dependent on fertilizers and pesticides, which themselves have a very bad effect on the environment. And so you need control. And I think governments, in fact, have to regulate, and they have to use the right methods in pushing agriculture in the right direction. Otherwise, you just get the kind of big capitalism, and it doesn't really work with agriculture. And I foresee in the longer term, maybe I'm too much of a visionary in this regard, but I think that with the wider introduction of information technology, we're going to see cities become less important than they were in the past. You will have people not going in and out every day for work. Indeed, future anthropologists will wonder what all those roads were for, because people will be living in more dispersed communities. And in a dispersed community, you're going to rely more on local food production. You're going to feel a much stronger sense of local attachment, and you're going to behave differently across the whole spectrum. Now, I think it's well for governments to look ahead and don't think that the huge concentration of people in cities is going to continue forever. They should also remember that cities are very vulnerable places to environmental change, or climate change in particular.
This is a major social change you're predicting here. People working from home, presumably people working in the local community. But it does require a rethink, not just in terms of agriculture. It's a vast socio-economic change, isn't it?
That indeed is what I believe. I think that we are at the moment at a very important stage in history when we rethink our economics. The kind of current calculations of gross domestic product or gross national product are highly misleading, because they can relate only to production. They don't relate to human happiness. They don't relate to the sense of fulfillment of a community. And indeed, every poll that is taken shows that those who make it their business just to make money and to consume as much as they possibly can are among the most unhappy people in our society. In fact, we have to try and think, when is enough enough? When do we want indeed to carry out our lives in a different way? And I think in some respects the kind of vision I have of the future society is more in tune with that than is many of those who simply want to keep on talking about economic growth and regard consumerism as a kind of religion.
But looking at what's happened in the financial markets, for instance, the activities of some of the players there, the people who deal in over-the-counter derivatives and this sort of thing, they don't appear to have shared that view. They seem to not even have learned from their experiences.
I think that when the treasuries of the world get on top of them, they may change their tune.
Do you think that perhaps this catastrophe might actually propel society in the direction you're talking about?
Well, I think that I'm a great believer in what I call benign catastrophes. When something goes visibly and attributably wrong, and then people feel obliged to do something about it. I wasn't happy with the banking crisis any more than anyone else. At the same time, I've often thought that this particular community was completely out of control and also irresponsible in many, many ways. I mean, when you think of the way in which top people, at the top of their professions, whether they be lawyers or top civil servants or ministers, whatever it is, what they would regard as their reasonable reward for their work they do, this is multiplied 150 times by what bankers are putting in their pockets. And for that reason, I have very little sympathy for bankers in any circumstances.
You have at the moment the derivatives market, which was in 2007, I think, worth nearly 700 trillion euros, or to put it another way, 70 times the gross domestic product of the entire world. This is monopoly money, isn't it?
It's complete joke money, and what people are calling the casino, which is what it is. And I think, therefore, this particular casino needs to be as regulated as other casinos are.
But how are we going to feed a population that could hit 9 or 10 billion people by between 2020 and 2050? Because that people have said here to me that this requires intensive agriculture, which of course degrades the soil.
I'm not sure that the population will rise to those giddy heights. It certainly could, but I don't think it necessarily will. And I think that as things become more difficult, so the incentives to reduce population will become stronger and stronger, because the resources of the earth simply can't match that. And one of the non-governmental organizations calculated that if everyone in the world had a living standard comparable to someone in California, you'd need 3 Earths rather than 1. So I would regard the question of population restraint as being extremely important, and I know what I regard as the 4 main factors which can lead to population constraint. One is giving women the same status as men, a very important point, especially in other parts of the world, although it's still coming along here, not entirely, but slowly. The second thing is education for girls as well as boys. The third is care in old age, so that people feel they don't have to have children to be looked after when they're old. And lastly, of course, is understanding of the human reproductive system and availability of contraceptive devices.
That is a very big call, though, isn't it? Because we have religions that are very much against, well, family planning, against giving women equal status, against allowing women to have a say in their own futures, in a sense. That's going to take a step change that would seem to be beyond the scope of current-day politicians. I
think it's a step change, but the step has already been taken in Western Europe and indeed in the United States. And interesting enough, in the Islamic world, it's already been taking place in Iran. In Iran, the attitude towards women has changed markedly in the last 15 years. And I believe those kind of and in Bangladesh likewise. So I think these things do happen. And there may be step changes, but they're steps we ought to consider taking.